Welcome to the first part of this Heritage Talk on uncovering Park Street. I'm Natasha and I work at Wessex Archaeology as the Community Engagement Coordinator. So today we're here to look at Park Street, a site in the centre of Birmingham. So as I said, I'm from Wessex Archaeology and I'll be joined by Dawn from Mola Headland Infrastructure and Emma as well from Wessex Archaeology today. Wessex Archaeology and Mola Headland Infrastructure are both commercial archaeological units, and that means they do archaeology before development happens. So today the site we're looking at is being developed for HS2, and I'm sure you're all familiar with HS2. So you can see on this map, we've got lots of different sites down the map, but Park Street is in the centre of Birmingham, for those of you who don't know. So HS2 is one of the largest archaeological programmes in the UK, and it involves over 1,000 archaeologists. So now I have a video to play you on a train through time.
The creation of HS2 is the biggest infrastructure project in Europe. The first new intercity railway to be built north of London in over a century. HS2 is being built in 2 phases. Phase 1 will link London and the West Midlands and is due to be completed by 2026. In Phase 2, the line will extend to Crewe by 2027 and followed by new lines towards Manchester and Leeds by 2033. But before we build bridges, tunnels, tracks and stations, an unprecedented amount of archaeological work will take place along the line of the route. HS2's archaeology programme is the largest ever undertaken in the UK. This once-in-a-generation opportunity allows us to reveal over 10,000 years of British history. Come with us as we take a train through time. Our journey starts a long time ago in the Paleolithic period, where early ancestors roamed in groups hunting and gathering food, then settled and learned how to farm and discovered the secrets of making bronze and iron. We will then travel forward in time to see the mark the Romans left on Britain. From their straight roads and new systems of government to sanitation and town planning. Following the departure of the Romans, we head into medieval Britain. We'll see the effect the Black Death had on villages, towns and cities, and gain insight into how critical battles in the Wars of the Roses unfolded. The final leg of our journey takes us to the Industrial Revolution, where the landscape and infrastructure of Britain saw dramatic changes. Factories were built and the economy grew. In the 19th century, the steam rail network revolutionised how we moved goods and people across the country. In the 21st century, HS2 gives us a chance to do so again, creating a fairer, more balanced and prosperous Britain. Using the skills and expertise of an unprecedented number of archaeologists, all artefacts and human remains will be treated with the dignity, care and respect they deserve. And all discoveries will be shared with communities, retelling the stories of our past, helping us understand what made us as a country. The sheer scale of possible discoveries, the geographical span, and the vast range of our history to be unearthed makes HS2's archaeology programme a unique opportunity to tell the story of Britain, whilst leaving a lasting legacy for generations to come.
Hello,
hello. Hello.
Hi. So as I said, Emma is from Wessex Archaeology and Dawn is from Mola Headland Infrastructure, and you'll be seeing more of them during this webinar. Right, so I will hand you all over to Emma.
Thanks, Tash. Brilliant. So good afternoon and thank you for taking the time today to watch this webinar. As Tash said, I'm Emma Carter and I'm a commercial archaeologist for Wessex Archaeology. Now, as archaeologists, we are sometimes quite fortunate to work on sites that might pique the public interest. And for the next 3 days, we'll be delving into 3 different sites and they're absolutely wonderful. We'll look at these sites through these online webinars as part of the Heritage Open Days. We'll be looking at cemeteries, moats and manor houses, and also prehistoric settlements, eventually spanning over a millennia of history in the Midlands. But we'll begin today with Park Street, and it's perhaps one of the most evocative, tangible and well-known sites across the route of HS2. And certainly, if you live in or around Birmingham, it'll be difficult not to have seen it in the news. Park Street is filled with hundreds of skeletons, hundreds of lives affected by industry, and hundreds of stories of labour and loss. And the archaeological results of Park Street can tell us just as much about the living as the dead, as pestilence and progress went hand in hand at this point in the 19th century. So the map that you can see is from 1843, and you might be able to pick out the church in the centre. Now, the red arrows here, if you look at the one on the left, that's St Martin's, and just next to it, where that red arrow is the Bullring Market Square. Now, the second arrow is perhaps a little bit more important for us in this talk, is on the upper right, and that actually points to Park Street Burial Ground. It's important here that we do point out that Park Street was an area of land specifically for the deceased population of Birmingham. It wasn't a churchyard, because by this point the churches were already full. Now, towards the end of the 18th century, Birmingham was in the steaming throes of revolution. Its canals and workshops were the vena cava that pumped into its industrial heart. The Industrial Revolution had a big effect upon the city, and we can see Park Street Burial Ground for the first time in Pye's map from 1819. Park Street received its first burial in 1810 and would actually go on to be used intensely for just 63 years, closing to new burials by 1873. Now, the purple lines that you can see in both these images actually demarcate the site boundary of the burial ground, and we can clearly see from its earliest inception that there's a northern area and a southern area. What's important to note about these two earlier maps is that the open spaces and courtyards surrounding the park, they will soon become jumbled up in a mass of back-to-backs and workshops by the mid-century. Now, if you move on to some later maps, we've got two maps here, one from 1849 and 1889. The earliest one we'll look at first, and it's a map by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, which is a beautifully named and real society in Victorian England. And it shows the city becoming clustered. Those smaller open spaces have been filled in, and those internal courtyards becoming more and more crowded with additional buildings. Now, the buildings are still unlabelled, so they could actually represent quite a few different things. They could be commercial, industrial, or even residential in their use. And one of the really important developments at this point in the area is the faint grey dashed line. So if you look at the earlier map, there is a dashed line running diagonally, where Tasha's showing now, thank you, cutting across the southern area of the burial ground. Now, this dashed line will become the Great London North Western Railway. We can also see it there in 1889 as it's actually built. Now, by 1889, as the fin de siècle approaches, Park Street Burial Ground has interred its last body and is now established as a park that we can see in this lovely image here. It has formal pathways, borders, seats, and even a drinking fountain. You might not trust the water quality though. So Park Street Gardens is now labelled up on the maps, and whilst Park Street was an open space, that ordered Tetris style of overlay of buildings and back-to-backs becomes denser. To the east of the park, we've got those back-to-backs like I mentioned, and then also various houses, works and pubs. So with the appealing allure of better jobs and better prospects, people were drawn from rural life into the big city. Birmingham was a city of 1,000 trades, it was the workshop to the world, and so the pull was great and the population was dense. But with these jobs in trades like metalworking, engineering, and other very physically demanding work, high death rates abound. Dangers of being horrifically mangled by machinery, bones warped from poor nutrition, as we'll see later. It's probably a result of the terrible pain of all that horrible bones, and even the myriad of diseases that came with living in close proximity to many people were always very, very close at hand. Now, in the 18th century, Birmingham actually received its kind of major swarming influx of people, and the population increased by 900%. Housing standards and sanitation couldn't keep up with diseases like cholera, typhoid, and smallpox, as they could potentially sweep through these densely populated areas. People were stacked on top of each other in life and at home, and then eventually go on to face the same overcrowding and death, as we'll see later with the excavations at Park Street.
So what are we looking at in this image, Emma? It doesn't look very pleasant.
No, it's grim, it's dark, it's crowded, and these poor souls are all suffering from cholera. So the image is actually a woodcut, and it's depicting the ravages of cholera by the National Philanthropic Association in 1850. Now, it's worth mentioning that Birmingham did have slightly better sanitation and more sources of natural water than other of the major cities, but they were still affected by cholera. What we can see here is probably one of the rooms in the back-to-back houses. It's very, very dense with lots of bodies. Some of them are probably hopefully alive at this point, but they all have cholera, and the conditions aren't very good for convalescence and sort of feeling better or well. We can see in the background those windows are broken. There's some damp rags hanging up. There's a very, very small stove to the right, and probably the whole family and then some all bunched up in here. We can see women and babies all just bundled in the same area, and probably quite unfortunately, perhaps the source of their woe is probably to do with the shared water. So at the front of this image, we've got that wooden water butts next to that person's shoes. Now, cholera, all your liquids are coming out, you can't control it, you're very, very unwell. So with this kind of close and densely populated area, I can't imagine that they'll be surviving too well from this image. Now, just as trades and industry were changing, so too were burial practices, and this is the really key thing for Park Street. The traditional manner of churchyard management was for those freshly dead or shrouded bodies to be interred directly into the ground and allowed to decay naturally. And this allowed the bones to either decay enough to be worked into the soil or removed to charnel pits, crypts, or vaults made for this purpose.
I've not heard the word charnel before. Can you explain what that means, Emma?
Yeah, so a charnel pit or charnel house, as they're sometimes called, is basically a repository for bodies, and more commonly bones, really, rather than bodies. And it's also a really important part of churchyard management. So areas of the churchyard were rotated to ensure adequate time for nature to take its course. It's a bit like how a farmer rotates their fields. Some areas go fallow and rejuvenate. The churchyard will suffer the same space-saving issue. So you had to wait for those bodies to decompose. Then when those bones were just bones and not flesh anymore, you could put them into those charnel pits, so they save space. However, changes in funerary traditions to include the permanent use of coffins and permanent monuments made these early traditions almost impossible and unfeasible. So if you think about it, we can imagine that a rapidly increasing population with densely populated areas, with poor sanitation, dangerous work conditions, does lead to very, very high mortality rates. So space is at a premium, and people are dying quicker than their bodies are decaying. So it's quite a grim and grisly world in the 19th century. Now, on describing the state of the churchyard of St Martin's in the Bullring, the English poet, historian and Bromley native William Hutton said in 1738 that the dead are raised up, and instead of the church burying the dead would in time have buried the church. This treacherous and evocative image is the century where Birmingham's population has increased by 900%, but it actually took another 30 years before Park Street Burial Ground was built as a response to the tide of newly dead. Now, the image that we can see, it's beautifully grim, and it's actually one of the skeletons from Park Street. They've got coins in the eyes, and it's a tradition that is kind of firmly entrenched with bodies. We often see it in sort of 19th century images where they're putting coins in the eyes to keep the eyes closed. We might even see it in films depicting more antiquated points in history. There's a very, very keen sense in our English traditions to place coins on the eyes. It can go back to the Romans and the River Styx, but it's probably just been part of our funerary traditions. So death was very, very close during the 19th century, and cartoons like King Cholera on the right and then the ravages of cholera from the Wellcome collection on the left really show the proximity of mortality in day-to-day life. A very popular poem by Emily Browning, Because I Could Not Stop the Death I do recommend you read it. It actually reinforces the pressing fears of mortality as you go about through life. So death and disease were a huge part of your day-to-day life, and Birmingham, city of 1,000 trades, was also keen to capitalise on the scientific and the macabre. Surgeons were in high demand, but how could they treat the human body if they didn't understand how it worked? This begins a very kind of dark and tumultuous relationship between death, disease, and the preservation of science and the pursuit of knowledge. So anatomy schools were becoming increasingly popular, and they were responsible for perhaps one of those darker and more dehumanizing professions that was suddenly gaining traction and demand. Two brothers, William and John Hunter, are actually viewed as the men responsible for kickstarting the whole industry of body snatching in the 19th century. They had their own private anatomy school in Covent Garden, and over a 12-year period, it was said that they went through 2,000 corpses, as after all, how could medical students possibly learn if they didn't have the bodies to practice on? But with no legal supply of bodies, the pursuit of science took a very dark turn indeed. So prior to the passing of the Anatomy Act in 1832, the only legal means to obtain bodies was from the gallows. The Murder Act of 1752 allowed the judge in a murder trial to ordain that the body of an executed murderer to be handed to the surgeons for anatomy. So it amounted to a final posthumous punishment for the most heinous of crimes. However, the demand for fresh cadavers was greater than the gallows could deliver, and resurrection men or body snatchers undertook the shady work in the dead of night to deliver the supply of fresh corpses to the rather well-to-do in anatomy schools. Now, providing you could actually stomach this dark and grisly work, a corpse that was still fresh could actually fetch 12 shillings, so about 60p, and that was the equivalent of a week's wages for an unskilled labourer. So you can see that's quite high in demand and has a high payoff for these trades.
Thank you for watching part 1 of this heritage talk on uncovering Park Street.